Good afternoon, and welcome to this session on smart cities, hype or hope. My name is Steve Koonin, and this topic is actually about my day job, where I'm the director of the Center for Urban Science and Progress at New York University, which is a research and education unit in the university that works closely with the city government and corporations on solving urban problems using big data. I'm pleased to be having a conversation today with Mark Gorenberg. Mark, in his day job, is the managing director for Zeta Venture Partners, and that's a firm that invests in among other things, data-driven analytic enterprises, startups, across the whole economic landscape, various sectors in the economy, government, and so on. But Mark is particularly suited to have this conversation about smart cities because about a bit more than a year ago, he was the co-chair of a PCAST panel. PCAST is the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, a group of people from academia, government, and industry who advise the White House on important issues in science and technology. Mark co-chaired a panel on future technologies for cities, or cities for future technologies. That panel issued a report at the end of last year, made some very cogent recommendations, and will form the basis for some of our conversation today. So Mark, why don't we start out and, what's a smart city?
Well, Steve, first of all, let me talk a little bit about how we got here to the idea of smart city. Cities have been exploding in terms of their population. Probably only about 30% of the world were in cities in the 50s, but now it's 54%. We're adding worldwide about 1 million people a week. So we project that's going to be at least 2/3 in the next 20 years, and the US is already 80% in these large metropolitan areas. And that's been spurned by sort of 3 revolutions in the last 150 years, or 3 big inventions, one being the steam engine, one being the electric grid, one being the automobile, and that produced 90% of our GDP in these metropolitan areas, but it's also created a lot of problems.
Some people would add the elevator, the electric elevator.
Elevator is part of it, yes. The electric grid helped us create the elevator,
too. The ability to go vertical, right.
Agree with that.
Yeah.
And so, there's a high cost of living in cities, there's congestion, horrible commutes, public health crisis, old utility infrastructure, a lot of issues about resilience and sustainability. And in the process of the last period from World War II on, we've also seen the core of most of our cities hollow out. So we've had that issue as well. But starting around 2010, we started to see this change that came about by digital technologies. And that really is yet a new evolution, and it's starting to see people move back to the city. And that change has given us a huge opportunity to go after some of these challenges. And that was part of the reason why we opted to study this, and part of the reason why we wrote this. This is our prop of our report from PCAST. And also, if I can, I want to take the opportunity to recognize Harold Varmus, who's here.
Yes, Harold.
Harold was one of our co-chairs at the start of this administration before he went to run the National Cancer Institute.
So we've seen, and you know very well, throughout society, we're now seeing the digitization of everything and all the benefits that brings to the private sector. Are we really talking about just doing the same sort of thing for cities, or are cities intrinsically more complicated? Some would argue they're the most complex creations that people have made. They combine environment, infrastructure, and that vexing dimension called people.
Yes, right. And governments, too.
And government, oh yes, let's not forget.
Even more vexing.
Yes, even more vexing, right. So is it bringing that sort of thinking and technology to cities?
It's a huge system. Cool. And that's why it's been perhaps one of the laggards in what's happening now in this change. But digital technology, allowed us to move from the idea of ownership to access. Now we've got the cell phone. And so that's the first thing. And people are obviously going to use that for a myriad of services. They already are, and the imagination is running rampant on what you can do with that. The other is that this whole wave of the Internet of Things and industrial wave of sensors. So 50 billion sensors by 2020. A lot of sensors and data are going to be put into cities, and you're one of the leaders of that. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're doing at CUSP as well. But a lot of that is going to now instrument these cities and give us data for the first time that we've never had. But cities have this other dimension, and this is one of the things that PCAST saw, was it's not just this idea of data and sensors and what we've sort of thought about as smart cities the last 20 years. It's we've got these huge technology changes all happening at the same time that can re-platform cities and really go through a huge transformation, and that's the bold vision. So when you add to all of that, huge changes in transportation technology, some of which we saw earlier today in autonomous vehicles, energy systems, which you were undersecretary, right, at DOE, so you're even more familiar with this than I am. Water systems, all of these before were set up for these huge metropolitan areas. Now we have to think smaller, and we have a lot of choices for that in terms of those technologies. Plus, beyond that, things like manufacturing, that now with things like 3D printing have a chance to come back to the city. So, and housing and buildings. So we have a chance to really remake our cities, and we started to recognize that some of the rest of the world is getting pretty far ahead of us. And it's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. So we can't afford to lose.
So talk about some of the other places in the world where this kind of thing is happening and how we're falling behind, perhaps?
Well, I think we've fallen behind on 3 dimensions. One of them is in terms of technological experimentation, right? So you have a city like Copenhagen, right? They have put in almost full district energy systems now. Half of their transportation is due to biking and walking, a tremendous number of bike lanes. Right? They put in very smart water systems, sewage systems. They've taken their environmental footprint down there. They're down very close to zero. And so that's a revolution that's happening there. But then you have experimentation also going on in Sweden, in Germany, in places like Hamburg. So Europe's done through a lot of experimentation. The UK recognizes from a leadership standpoint, so on another dimension, they created a minister of cities, effectively a cabinet member of cities, which we don't have here. And then on the other side in Asia, where they really have the problem because of the huge influx of people in cities, they're spending a ton of money. The Asian Investment Bank, I think, is $18 billion a year now on city projects. And we have the added dimension of, of a Congress that is not spending money on these issues and local governments that have no money. Right. So those are a number of our challenges.
So let's talk about some of the governmental problems here. I mean, in our federal system, there's this thing between the federal government and the cities called the states.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult, I think, for the federal government to directly affect what's going on in cities. The closest thing we have is housing and urban development, which has at least got the word urban in its title, but transportation, energy, health and human services don't have an explicit urban focus to them, although they certainly touch on urban issues. So what kind of recommendations did your report make to try to get around some of that?
Well, in some sense, it's actually worse because of this transformational change and how money is set up already in in evergreen projects. So what do I mean by that? So you can think about this, that, as I said, we've gone over 100 years where we've been thinking about cities now spreading out into large metropolitan areas. So by definition, transportation budgets now are around the continued perpetuation of suburbs connected to cities by highways, so large part in highway budgets. And energy is based on huge systems with, the whole system of generation, transmission, et cetera, large power plants, water, large water systems. So now you've got that, and that has its own amount of money that's set aside and keeps getting propagated. And now you want to make this big abrupt change. So the good news of this change is that, one, we believe that we're moving from these big metropolitan areas to this notion of districts. So one is about the experimentation in districts that are so important. So you can't really think about, as you pointed out, cities are very complicated. You can't think about experimenting on a whole city. So pick an area that's, like 1 kilometer and think about that. So that was our first thing, was looking at the idea of experimentation in districts. The second thing was that data is so critical that you need to create data sharing between cities, so this notion of a city web.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing is that integration amongst these becomes very important.
Yeah, it really is a system of systems after all.
Right.
And then the ability to, data standards are also really important because you want to be able to compare one city to another or one district to another and so on.
That's right. So in the integration, if you think about this, vehicles are idle 95% of the time. So if you can move to autonomous vehicles, as we heard, now all of a sudden you're getting more use. But also on average, 30% of a city, downtown city, is used up for parking.
Right.
LA is 81%. So if you can get that space back, now all of a sudden by using autonomous vehicles that can basically drive themselves away and park somewhere else and can be used for ride sharing. Yeah. Okay, now you can use that space for biking and walking lanes. Mm-hmm. You can use it to create new housing and more dense housing. And once you've created that new housing, you can now start to think about these district energy and district water systems to be used for that. So you can transform the whole concept by thinking about this one district. So the experimentation is important, the data sharing is important, the integration is important. And I think the other thing that's really important in this idea of cities is that you really need to create a system that's bottom up. The early smart cities were all sort of top-down thoughts, right? Here we need to create an infrastructure that people, entrepreneurs, can experiment on.
Very good. Yeah, there are some famous examples of planned cities that just died, right?
Right.
Starting with Mussolini and EUR in Italy, Celebration in Florida from Disney. So I don't think we've understood how to integrate the human and the technical yet, although many people are now motivated to try to experiment with that.
Right. The top-down just didn't work.
Yeah. It really is a very intriguing notion, at least for those of us who are technical, but when you actually try to do it on the ground, as we're trying to do in CUSP and other centers around the US, in Chicago, in Seattle, and Atlanta, you start to run into some problems. Let's start with one you alluded to already. Cities are not great customers. They are stovepiped. They tend to be stodgy.
Right.
They have procurement rules and so on. And how do you think we're going to be able to meet that particular challenge? So
the first thing we talked about was trying to create cross-agency groups. So Commerce has its own set of programs. HUD has its own set of programs, and HUD doesn't have a technology capacity, which they need to add. DOT has its own set of programs, DOE has its own set of programs. So we talked about trying to combine those, and we talked about that sort of combined cross-agency group effectively running competitions. So the leader of that this year is DOT. So DOT has come out with something they call the Smart City Challenge.
Transportation. Yeah.
Transportation, yes, thank you. They came out with something called the Smart City Challenge. They got 78 cities to apply. Their carrot was $40 million of experimentation money. Right? So they got 78 cities to apply. They picked 7 finalists, and then from that, they picked Columbus, Ohio. And they've put together 4 districts for work, and that's really galvanized, to your question, the local groups, the governments, the private sector, to all work together to try to make that happen. And they've picked 4 districts, one being a residential district, one being a downtown district, one being a commercial district, and one being sort of a logistics district out by the airport. So the transformation of all of these with some of these ideas, like smartphones for services, like electric vehicles to help with ride sharing and also to lower the pollution levels. One of the big things that they're solving with this is into a low income residential area, which they chose. It has 4 times the national average in infant mortality, primarily because the infrastructure is not set up well to tackle the problem once it's found. So there was there's a whole proposal on just the streamlining and the transportation and the smartphone applications to help low-income citizens to solve that particular health problem. And I think we'll see some fruits of that in the next couple of years.
I don't think there's going to be somehow a sudden transition from a dumb city to a smart city. We're seeing a lot of the technologies already put into use. If you think about how we get around cities now, how we move goods, we order and deliver goods, at least in the big metropolitan areas, how we can monitor the environment, how we can book a table in a restaurant compared to what we were able to do, let's say, 15 years ago. Things have changed an awful lot. And so I think we're already moving down that road. It's just going to get better and better in many ways.
Yeah, I would agree.
What are some of the problems that you see? Well, I can tell you, if you mentioned before, CUSP is, we do research and education, and maybe it's worth just listing some of the problems we're working on, our projects, to give you and give everybody else a sense of what the potential is. I grew up in New York City and had not lived there for about 50 years or 45 years when I moved back in as an adult. And it's a wonderful city compared to 45 years ago. But the biggest complaint I have is noise. And I swore I was going to get those guys who are banging the trash cans every Wednesday at 2 in the morning. And so we started a project which is now being deployed called Sonic, which is a set of sensors that monitor noise and not just monitor decibels, but also characterize the noise. Is that a truck backfiring? Is that a jackhammer? Is that a dog barking? We've already deployed the first 10 of those sensors. We have another 90 that have been constructed and are awaiting deployment. And I expect that that will both make a big impact on noise enforcement. Noise regulations are very poorly enforced in New York. I expect that it will play into public health, since noise stress is one of the dominant urban stressors. And then finally, I think it will change real estate values. If you can look up what the noise levels are in a particular property you're looking at, that will change things. We've got the boxes cost only $100 a piece. Many people have already volunteered to host a box out their window, and I think that will be a big win. Another in the sensor side of things, we've discovered that you can put sensors on the top of a roof in an urban setting and watch to great effect 1,000 buildings at once. And you can learn about energy consumption. But particularly important for public health, you can see which buildings are emitting soot plumes and when they're emitting it and where is the soot going. That soot from the buildings caused by heavy heating oil is the largest contributor to particulate pollution in New York City, more than the diesels. And the environmental protection folks are very interested to know who's doing it and when, so that they can crack down. At the very least, we can name and shame, right? If you've got images and you can just put them on the web, people can get very exercised about that. There are many others, and at some point maybe I'll go through more in the conversation. I think it gives people a sense of the kind of things that you can imagine doing in a smart city that we're not currently doing.
Well, New York, one of the prolific projects of New York was predicting fires in buildings, right? So you now have a system in place using all that data where you can sort of reorder the list of buildings for inspection.
Right.
For fire inspection, which has really cut down on the number of fires in New York, predictive analytics there.
Right.
Chicago's using predictive analytics now to look for rats, which has been very, which has been very productive, and it's actually worked really well.
Right.
And they followed through all the different data trends to realize it's all about how water piles up.
Right.
So they can look at all the sensors, look at water, look at rat infestations. And LA has done some pretty spectacular things with their streetlight system. So they've been able to cut down commutes, I've heard, as much as 25% in some areas by how they've been able to retime the streetlight in real time as cars are going through them.
I mean, the process needs to be, we need to get the data. The data needs to be broad coverage, highly granular in time or in space or both. Then you need to build a model for it and use that model to intervene, whether it's changing the timing of the lights or targeting inspections, things of that sort.
Right.
Another thing that you can do with the data is efficiency and allocation. So we're doing a big thing on building energy, and you can look at energy consumption patterns, correlate them with what goes on in a building, what year was the building constructed, identify the outliers, the big energy hogs, and then target them for interventions either by the energy companies or by the city to show them, hey, you're in the 90th percentile of energy use per square foot in your building class. Don't you think you should do something?
Because gamification works in almost all different environments.
Yeah, right. We're also great fans, again, to give people a sense of the kind of unusual data that's out there, of taxis in New York City. There are 13,000 yellow cabs in the city. They make 500,000 rides a day. And we have, for the last 5 years now, the start and stop location, the time, the fare, the tip, the driver, the medallion number for every one of those rides. The data is not perfect. Some of the rides start in the middle of the East River, and you've got to go clean that kind of stuff up. But it's really interesting, not only revealing transportation patterns, but behavioral patterns. Are the tips higher when the weather is bad, for example? Or is the tip lower when the fare ends up in a rich neighborhood or a poor neighborhood? Things of that sort, you can get insight into behavior as well as helping people find out where they can get a cab more quickly and efficiently than they might otherwise. So, you can sit at a blackboard, as I've done many times, with someone and fill 2 blackboards with the kinds of projects that you might imagine doing for a smart city. It's a target-rich environment.
And there's a lot of research areas that's going on. One of our recommendations was that the agencies are very siloed in the research that they're doing, and to try to do a cross-cut across that so they can all learn from each other. One of the byproducts that came out of that is something called the Metro Lab Networks. So the Metro Lab Networks now is, it's the pairing of city chief technology officers with their university research lab. And they've been solid, and now I think there's
45, something like that.
45 pairs of them, which started with all gathering in the White House in September of last year. But some of those projects that are interesting, like for example in South Bend, Notre Dame and South Bend work together. They have a huge problem with runoff for sewage. So they were able to put sensor systems in. I think it was about $6 million after a bunch of research, and that really solved the issue. And something that in conventional means would have taken well over $100 million to solve. Pittsburgh is seeing the same thing, I think, with their streetlights as well.
Carnegie Mellon and
That's right.
It's a wonderful topic for universities. That's why you see a lot of universities jumping in. There's a consortium in Boston, which involves MIT and Harvard and Northeastern. We have New York, not only NYU, but Columbia, are all moving into space. Chicago, of course, is famous for this. It requires, apart from the physical science for the sensors, it requires data scientists to come together, social scientists, which is a very unusual and unnatural pairing in the university, and then people who understand the city government. And so it is maybe the ultimate multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary kind of activity.
Well, as we're moving cities to this new platform, you're also moving from urban planning to urban science.
Yeah, right.
So it's a whole new discipline.
We talk to urban planners, and some of them look at some of the things we're doing and say, gosh, we would have never thought about that. So for basic scientists, it's also an attractive venue because it's new data, and new data leads to new science often, as well as whatever applications that you can imagine.
Right. So MIT, in talking about that, so the MIT Consortium group also created a whole new simulator. And from that, they did a lot of work in trying to look at the commute patterns in Boston and came up with, and a lot of what we're trying to do, and a lot of the reason for writing a report also, is to try to make sure that cities preserve a level of equity, that we don't end up in disparity between the people who can afford to live in cities and those who can't, and those who can't are really not brought forward. So their work took the commutes from some of the poorest neighborhoods. In fact, people can't get credit cards, have trouble getting cell phones, et cetera, but we're looking for jobs downtown. And they cut their commute from an hour and a half to about 20 minutes by coming up with a new transportation system, which Boston is now implementing.
Save 2 hours a day for people.
Exactly, and made it feasible for them. In the Columbus study, they for people who don't have credit cards, they've created a whole new city card out of that, so that different city services are part of that, and they have one aggregated place, and they can also look across that to get a better idea of what's happening in terms of people's spending patterns.
Another application, which the credit card, I assume, is one instance of, is the use of data to give the lending institutions greater confidence in lending to people, whether it's to give them a credit card or to make a loan to a small business. If you can look at the statistical patterns in a neighborhood, then you can get more confidence in the kind of decisions that you're making.
That's right.
In that regard.
The other side of that is the implementation of technologies for the good of lower income areas, which HUD started to work on, but then areas like, as you know, DOE got involved. So for example, now they're creating new buildings that are all solar. And that solar power in these low income housing areas are better than the buildings need. So they're actually selling it back into the grid, and they're basically able to subsidize the buildings even more.
New York City announced the establishment of 5 neighborhood labs, one in each of the boroughs. We're working closely with the city on at least one of them, and that one is in Red Hook, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, and full instrumentation, video, street sensors, building energy, with the cooperation, in fact, full participation of the citizenry. We're doing citizen science projects with the high school kids in that area, get them to go out and measure what's going on in their neighborhoods, get them engaged in the process, as well as helping the neighborhood itself.
That's right. So we looked at this from sort of three different axes. One was the equity axis that we just talked about, and what kinds of projects can you put in, and how can technology help to make sure cities stay diverse and cities basically grow in equity. But in terms of other areas, one of them was about mobility that we talked about. Today, if you sort of put it all together, there's about 320 billion lost a year in traffic collisions, putting the tragedy of deaths aside. But we estimated $1.2 trillion a year lost due to congestion and other forms of sort of wasted transportation today. So that's one axis that can really be helped by ride sharing and new transportation technologies. But then the other was on this notion of creating green districts. Creating energy efficient districts or better green districts. What we found was that in creation of new buildings and these districts around these buildings and the technologies associated with energy, water, building materials, that you can get it costs a little bit more at the beginning, but you get about a 3-year payback. And then you get about 18% a year after that in terms of cost improvements. But the other thing you get out of it is 60% less use of fresh water, 20% less waste created by landfill, and 50 to 60% less vehicle miles. They're driven by sort of compacting these districts together, which I think is the future of all this. The other thing that's interesting beyond these axes is that this is also very generational. So they did surveys the last couple of years and found that if you ask people, and be interesting for this audience, if you ask people what's more important, good internet access or owning a car, that of millennials, 46% said they would rather have good internet access than own a car. But only 15% of baby boomers.
Sounds right.
So it's an evolution.
Although it may also be a
state
of life. I mean, if you start a family and move out to the suburbs, the car may start to be more important to you than the Wi-Fi. So it'd be very interesting to see what happens in the next 10 years or so. Why don't we spend a little bit of time talking about some of the problems here? We've been talking a lot about the benefits. What are the problems in making this vision come into a reality? And one of them that we face routinely in CUSP as we're trying to do this is what I like to call data hoarding. The data sets are extraordinarily interesting and valuable, but they tend to be owned by different entities, and nobody wants to share. I like to say that second most basic human urge is to hoard data. The academics do it because of proprietary publication priority. The businesses do it because it's valuable. and the government agencies do it sometimes even within the government because information is power and turf. And so we spend a lot of time with lawyers drafting and executing data sharing agreements with various entities. And I wonder whether in the PCAST deliberations there was any thought given to data standards, norms of data sharing, and so on.
We did. We made recommendations about that because that's one of the areas the federal government can do is to help with the creation of standards and also leadership in that front. So we have a chief data scientist now, DJ Patel.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first chief data scientist that the federal government's ever had.
Very interesting guy.
Very interesting guy.
Right.
Which allows you to set the stage for that. So we asked that he start to look across different agencies in that, and also set standards for that. The other interesting issue about data is that a lot of it is by the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you create incentives? So we talked a lot about what are some of the recommendations to try to create incentives for the private sector to be able to share this data. So in the absence of, in these technologies forming and the absence of the government actually being in charge of them, the private sector has stepped in, and obviously Uber and Lyft, et cetera, become great entities. They have a lot of data. Mm-hmm. They have actually very interesting data, and you want them to share data with the city to be able to, figure out a better infrastructure for all of us combined. What some of the cities have started to find is they're actually somewhat amenable to that if it's anonymized and also if the data is not going directly to their competitors. Mm-hmm. So for city use. So we're working on the incentives for that, but the city obviously owns the infrastructure. So there's a lot of incentives that they can play, and I think we'll see that start to come together. The other is that we called on NIST to get involved to try to jumpstart this idea of a city web. Mm-hmm. So, and what I mean by that, it's all the data, all the methods, all the algorithms, the applications that get formed, et cetera, in cities. And today, so LA, Chicago, New York can do that. Small cities can't do that. Yeah. And a lot of other cities can't have the budget for that. So how do you start to create a way for them to share with that, get standards around that, so that that data can then be analyzed to be used for smaller cities? And that, we looked at NIST starting to do the same thing that it did when the W3C started, which is there's a little bit of money that gets started to try to put standards groups together, try to juice that up, try to get started to put that
W3C was?
World Wide Web Consortium.
Right, good.
In the beginning creation of the World Wide Web, there was also the IETF, right, for the internet. But those two started with sort of NIST kind of helping to put the yeast in. Mm-hmm. It's National Institute of Standards out of the Department of Commerce to do that.
Arthur used to run that, as we said this morning. So you mentioned the magic word, which is very important in this whole discussion of anonymity or anonymizing the data. And privacy, for better or worse, is an integral part of the smart city story. Cities are built by people, they're built for people. The people are probably the most important and most problematic component of them. Privacy norms are very important to all of us who are doing this work. We're going to have to learn how to manage that privacy dimension as we try to do the kinds of things that we've been talking about. Yeah,
and it's a very interesting topic. PCAST did another study purely on data and privacy. Mm-hmm. You find the United States has moved to the idea of not stopping collection, but trying to be very stringent on use of that data. Europe is sort of the other way today, where they have much more stringent rules about collection of data. So, and that's still being worked out. But for the most part, I think the good of the United States is we've started to understand the benefits of this data is so valuable that not collecting it at all. Yep. And I think most citizens in the country have now sort of accepted. Certainly they do for their normal transactions. I mean,
sure.
I mean, the commerce systems in our private sector life have tons of information.
And we benefit from it as consumers, right? I mean, when the credit card company calls you up and says, that charge looks funny, they're analyzing it against all your other data and all the data of all their other cardholders and doing pattern matching. Right?
And the government, the best thing of all is if the data is open. And so the government has led by example.
Mm-hmm.
So the start of this administration, when President Obama came in office, I think there were about 47 open data sets. And now there are somewhere north of 200,000 or 300,000.
Yeah.
This has been one of the great legacies of this administration, to make a lot of data public for great use.
Right, and it's really shown its benefits. The cities are doing the same. New York City has 1,100 data sets in Open Data NYC. Some of them are very useful, others of them are hardly ever looked at all, but at least the government is making its data open. But the individual data is really what is problematic, at least in the eyes of many people. And I think, in the commercial sector, it's wild, wild west. There are effectively no internal controls in the data companies, as far as I understand. The universities who are working in this field are trying to establish policies, procedures, norms, training people so that the data is handled in a responsible way.
I think that's right. And you talk about people working. So that's one topic we haven't touched on, but that's a huge topic that came out of this, which is that if we re-platform all our cities, there's a lot of opportunities for the new workforce. If you think about something just very simple, right, as putting all the people involved in recreating buildings around solar. Imagine how many people you could deploy in a new workforce to remake our cities.
Yes.
Around transportation, energy, water, et cetera. So part of our recommendations was about HUD and the Department of Labor starting to get involved to create both standards and also the idea of certification.
Right.
And the beauty of it is that the people who want to stay in their communities and work on rebuilding their communities can do that through that, get certified, and then be available to put these new systems in. And I'm sure you're dealing with workforce issues also.
Absolutely.
With New York.
So as you know, CUSP offers a one-year degree, a Master's of Science in Applied Urban Science and Informatics. And a couple weeks ago, we graduated 65, and next week we'll have about 85 entering and another 15 continuing students. These students get educated in data technology, and then they also get educated in urban. And they're much in demand after they graduate by cities, by startups, by companies that service cities. And so absolutely, I think there are tremendous employment opportunities, job creation, as we go about trying to make our cities smarter than they are.
And I think we'll see the blue collar and white collar side of this. What's interesting about the work that you're doing in urban science is this is sort of a forerunner to this whole field of AI and the use of all this data to be able to look across it for insights. That was also one of the big hopes of creating a city web. As you gather these billions of records of data, you can start to look for those patterns. And so we're going to need a lot of data scientists to understand cities in that way.
Right, and where the experience has shown that you just can't take a bunch of data and throw it at the data scientists and expect them to come up with insights. Sometimes they do, but you really have to understand the data. And so you need the operators, whether it's the inspectors or the traffic controllers or the teachers if you're doing education, to interact with the data scientists in a domain-specific way in order to get the greatest value out of the data.
Right.
That's one of the things didn't come across in the AI discussion I would have emphasized. The advances of the last couple years and the promise going forward are predicated on having enormous training data sets, whether it's texts or images that you can train up these algorithms on. And I think the cities, with all the buildings and the people and the vehicles, can offer that kind of massive data to do training.
That's correct. And you're going to need all that data to handle something as complicated as all the different silos of technologies that are being brought together.
Wonderful. We have hit the mark with about 10 minutes left, and maybe we can open it up to the floor for some questions. If those flag, I'm sure we can continue the conversation in other ways. Jim, we'll start over there.
So I'm finding myself understanding how you're using data to incrementally improve systems by getting data to make us smarter. But many of our cities have these immense investments in transportation infrastructure and all these other infrastructures. You have landowners, you have existing street systems. So I'm having a harder time imagining this more dramatic shift to where we're handling sewage and electricity and water and fundamental transportation systems differently, given what the record of the US is with tinkering with these things.
I think that's part of the reason why we had this notion that a city is just too large to change. But there will be small districts in these cities that are great experimentation points. And frankly, the cities that are in the middle are probably going to be the last ones to make changes, Jim, as you're talking about. I think where we're going to end up starting is in a combination of sort of more cities that are more blank piece of paper to start, or frankly, the cities that have really hollowed out. So if you look at some of the Midwestern cities, Columbus was one, for example, that was chosen here. They have already gone through this process now where picking a district and putting all these new technologies in and instrumenting it is viable. I think it's going to be, as you pointed out, these middle cities that already have an infrastructure in place, it's well supported, but it's not as good as it can be. We're going to see this tinkering. But there'll be a tipping point. And I honestly believe that as Department of Transportation led in terms of the Smart City Challenge for vehicles, I think once you see things like autonomous vehicles, let's say in the next 5 years, start to find their way to the downtowns of cities, which are perfect places for them, I think that's a huge turnover, because now, as we talked about, you're going to get all this land back. People are going to be clamoring for more bike lanes, wider streets for walkability. They're going to look at these new sort of more compacted housing that'll be affordable, where housing the way it is right now is becoming less and less affordable for people coming to cities. I think that's your next 5 to 20 years of transformation in cities, and that's why the integration of all this becomes so important.
I would add, I wouldn't despair entirely for shorter-term wins. The sense model control paradigm for building energy, transportation, even education, can get a lot out of existing infrastructure without having to tear the whole thing down or wait 50 years to rebuild the buildings or the roads or whatever it is needs to be done. Let's go back over there. Yeah.
This question's for both of you. When I think about the subway system in New York City, and that New York has been struggling with how they're going to add another 100 years to that existing system, do they now, with thinking smart, autonomous vehicles, do they now really need to rethink their subway strategy just because they may not need it? Is that some of the thinking that may be going into it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So let me
start
with
about New York.
Let me start with some numbers that may start to help understand what I think I'm going to say is the answer. I don't know yet. I'm thinking, but the population of Manhattan, let's just take that, just about doubles every workday. And so it goes from about 2 million round-the-clock residents and tourists and so on, students, to about 4 million people every day. They flow in from the suburbs and surrounding boroughs and so on. Only about 100,000 of those people come in on private vehicles. More come in on buses, and the great majority comes in on the subway system. The subway system, as I've gotten to know it a little bit from the inside in my current job, is an absolutely amazing operation. The infrastructure is old, yes, though they renew the cars. The control systems are 1950s vintage. You can go in Upper Midtown Manhattan. There's the control room for the power for the whole system. And it's a wooden board with lights on it and the tracks laid out and so on. The subway system moves 5.5 million people a day with great reliability. Not perfect, but pretty good. So I don't think we're going to see it disappear just because of the volume that it carries. It certainly needs to be upgraded. We start to see little upgrades, like you can now learn when the trains are arriving. We didn't have that before, at least on most of the lines, not all the lines. We've got Wi-Fi and cellular service on some fraction of the stations, and more of that is coming. But I think the notion of, trains running on the existing tracks with some form of electrical power is going to be there for a long time. We may see the drivers disappear, although there are union issues with that. We may be able to space the trains more tightly if our control is better, so that might improve efficiency as well. By the way, ridership keeps going up in the subway system. Most of the increase over the last 10 years has been in the off-peak hours, on evenings. It's the city that never sleeps, and the weekends. That's a really interesting operation.
So what I wonder is, not so much will something come and displace the subway and get rid of it, but what about the additive? So there are parts of New York right now that you don't get to very easily by subway, right?
Right.
The whole west side is being built out tremendously right now without a lot of subway access.
Right, and the middle of Queens, I mean, there's this whole, you look at the subway map, there's this whole middle of Queens to the northeast that's just not served at all.
So before you spend a lot more money on existing...
Good, right.
So before you spend a lot more money in the next wave on an older technology, do you add to it with an autonomous vehicle fleet, let's say a shareable that can add on and extend the subway system?
Sure.
I think that's where we're headed, is what do you add?
Yes.
As opposed to how much do you tear down?
Can you displace? Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah.
What's the political element that you, what's the political element you see for the comparison between our cities and the advancement in the European cities, which is not new, it's been going on for a long time? I mean, is it just states' rights and capitalism, or is there something else? Is it, you know, what makes it possible to have a single-payer healthcare system in Europe and we can't have it? I mean, what do you see as the political drawbacks in our system that make it so much more difficult?
Well, I would say one thing we talked about is the silos of government needs to somehow cross-pollinate. But in terms of spending, that's a bigger issue here. Obviously, we have a harder issue of new infrastructure investments. We called in the report for $10 billion a year in infrastructure investments by Congress that, you know, I don't think we'll see. But there's one other thing that we called for that I find very interesting that Europe doesn't have the issue, which is that we have a restriction right now on our municipal bonds, which is that a public infrastructure cannot be operated by the private sector and invested into as a muni bond. It's one of the ways that our country tries to keep conflict of interest out. But public-private partnerships are now a big wave. And public-private partnerships are right at the forefront in Europe, where a lot of the projects are frankly half-owned by each. So I think that's an issue that we need to grapple with, because that can really help with a lot more investment money coming into our cities right now.
You know, our system of government and its diversity of players, federal, state, city, the private sector being so important, has many advantages. But if you look at other governments around the world, particularly in the city's dimension, you understand what can be done without some of those barriers. Singapore is a wonderful example. Relatively small, 5 million people, building some of its, it's built all of its infrastructure basically in the last 60 years. Technocratic government, and has been able to do wonderful things. Now, Singapore as a city to live in is not a paradise, but you can start to understand how these smart technologies all play together to make a much more livable city than you might have imagined previously.
I mean, we're going to have to wrestle with this idea that we need the private sector. They're going to innovate anyway.
Yep.
The question is, how do you form a partnership along the way to make it work? And I think that's, for the next administration, part of this blueprint is going to be trying to figure out the best way to do that.
If I could find any fault with this administration in this dimension, it's been the lack of the private sector voice and understanding in the higher policy councils, both in the urban area and energy and several other dimensions as well. Yeah. Oh, okay. Is somebody queued next? Okay, good.
I was going to follow up, though, on your public-private partnership idea. Can you describe the financing alternatives that are available at the city level, not the federal level? A city wants to embark on a program for X or Y or Z, rats, smoke, whatever the type of things you mentioned. What are the different options they have to finance something like that? especially in today's world where cities don't have a lot of money?
You wanna start?
Unfortunately, a lot of it right now is very small research dollars that are going into starter projects. And we haven't proliferated this in a big way yet. And I think it's just going to require investment. So one way is research dollars. And that's really where I think it all starts. But what are you seeing
So I
for
would have
funding?
said, some of the things we're talking about do not require great capital investment. So in New York City, in the last 4 years of the Bloomberg reign, he established the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, was a small skunkworks team run by a guy named Mike Flowers, who's a very interesting character. And their brief was to collect data from across the city and do interesting things with it. And that took about a team of, let's say, 10 people, and they could get great efficiencies in the delivery of particular city services that they went after. So that doesn't require a lot. It takes a strong leader in the mayor or the center to say, we're going to do this, and get all the agencies to combine. But it was not hundreds of millions of dollars to make it happen.
Yes, really fascinating discussion, one near and dear to my heart. I guess my question is, as we've begun conversations with cities to explore this notion of public-private partnerships, because we clearly see the promise of autonomous vehicles being introduced into a transportation ecosystem in smart cities, the conversation is vastly different depending on what city you go to.
Right.
And it's even more different when you go to other countries. The conversations that we've had with Columbus and New York have been very different than the ones we've had with London, and even more different than the ones we've had with Shanghai. So what are your thoughts about here in the United States, how we could leverage policy to drive federal standards around conversations of public-private partnerships, resources that are more significant so we can really accelerate the notion of smart cities and standards and technology investments, and maybe even harnessing the power of the national laboratories and the university system. Can you comment on that?
Well,
Go ahead.
well, our very first recommendation in the report was the idea that we needed to we don't have a Department of Cities, so we don't have a central place for leadership on this issue. And the first thing was to say, at a minimum, we need to get Commerce, HUD, Department of Energy, and Department of Transportation together in a cross-agency way, and there are other agencies perhaps to add to that, to be able to be that voice, to talk about that. Our hope, honestly, was part of the fear was seeing what else was going on in the rest of the world, because this is a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, and we need to be setting the standards for this. We need to be creating the examples, because then our companies, through commerce, can start to help to export projects out. It's one of our best export opportunities over the next decade.
So just a comment on the problems from the business side. We sit with a lot of the technology companies, whether it's in aerospace or IT. They've all have the same kind of problem. They've got this wonderful engineering talent in particular disciplines. They know how to integrate systems together, but they don't know how to package it and interact with the cities in order to make a viable business case for it. And I don't think anybody's solved that problem yet.
And if I could just add one more before we go. So one of the best things we saw, why you're seeing interesting conversations in Columbus and New York, et cetera. So the 7 cities in the Department of Transportation Smart City Challenge wrote they really wanted to win that $40 million, right? So they, and I'm sure they all came to talk to you. And actually, I'd love to hear your comments afterwards, after this break.
Mm-hmm.
But that galvanized them to write real reports of how they were going to do that very specifically, and they brought all their groups together in their cities. I said in one San Francisco meeting, they had 30 people from all different parts of both government and private sector to put that together, and they are excited, and they're still excited because now they have their blueprint. So now they're trying to find their dollars to get started. But I think that 78 cities applying, 7 being chosen to write full reports, made a huge difference in their psychologies. So that's the reason why we think these competitions for ideas and having a group that decides on it and giving some dollars out to a few winners will have far greater benefit than the few that win those dollars.
So unfortunately, we're now at -5 minutes, but I hope we've given you some sense of what the potential is here, as well as what some of the challenges are in trying to realize this potential. So watch this space over the next 5 to 10 years and see how it does or does not affect your lives as urban citizens. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.